proposition is proudly propose a motion to mandate developing countries to have recycling programs. Now, let's start with a few definitions and understand exactly what we're saying by developing countries and what is our mechanism. And then we'll move on to explain why is it justified that we will step in the sovereignty of those countries and force them to have recycling programs. So let's begin. By developing countries, we mean every country that its GDP is much lower than the average GDP in the world. But it's keeping growing every year more and more. Now, in those developing countries, in our motion, we're talking about only the developing countries that their pollution levels are higher than the average in the world. So those are the countries we're talking about in this debate. Now let's understand our mechanism. Now we're going to work in our system in two different levels. The first level is by education, is by promoting the ideas of recycling and why recycling is important, by teaching it at schools, by having commercials, by having some sort of propaganda advertisements, etc. No thank you. Now, we believe that this action alone cannot stand and cannot work because this action is for the long term, because it takes time to educate people. This is the right thing to do. And therefore, we need to do something which is more immediate and more now, and this is forcing them to start recycling programs. No thank you. Now, what are those recycling programs? Recycling is a proliferation which is retroactive. It's after we had the pollution, is taking it and making it less bad. It's taking resources we already used and use it again and again. Just a second. Now, why are we talking specifically on recycle? Because we believe that because those are developing countries, we need we don't need to stop their development. We don't need to push them to give them more burdens while they're trying to develop, because it's important that they will develop. But after they did all this stuff, we need to help them to reduce the damage they cause to the world. Yes.
Sorry, just about your model. Who's implementing the programs?
Thank you. Actually, we're talking about the West that will be implementing the program. We will have the entire world will be implementing the program. Basically, we will have a committee in the UN that will be supervising this entire program and this entire process. So, okay, now what kind of recycling programs are we going to do? We're going to have recycling bins in the streets. We're going to have purification of waste, purification of sewage, etc., etc. We're talking about on the big companies that are working in the developing countries and both on the citizens who live and prosper in those countries. Now, let's understand for a second who will fund this project, because we understand that these programs cost a lot of money, and we don't want that this money will come as a burden only on the developing countries. We believe that, first of all, those developing countries should pay some of the program, because A, it helps the citizens of those countries, as we will further on explain in our second speech, and B, because those countries allowed it to happen and allowed the pollution to happen. But we believe that also the developed countries in the world should help those countries as well by donating such an amount of money that we will decide upon in our committee every year to help those countries, because by recycling that pollution, it helps the entire world, which we're going to explain furthermore in our first point. And second of all, we want to have recycling taxes, which is taking taxes from those big West companies which are working in the developing countries, taking a bit more taxes in order to actually imply those programs, because we believe that those companies cause a lot of the damage to the pollution and to the environment. So therefore, this is just logical to take it from them. Now, if the country won't do what we're saying and won't have this recycling program, we'll have economic sanctions on those countries. We believe that, first of all, by helping those countries, most countries will agree to those programs, and those who won't, we will sanction them, and by that we are mandating them. So let's move on to our first point, in which I'm going to explain why this is justified for us as the world to intervene in the sovereignty of those developing countries. Now, we have two reasons for that. First of all, we believe that the pollution creates a damage that influences all the world. It doesn't only, if the country causes damage, the government causes damage, that influence only the people in the country. So we won't generally we won't intervene, because this is the sovereignty of the country and we are allowed to do that. But once the country is harming everyone, the entire world, which is happening right now, because when they pollute, they also affect me, they also affect Canada. They also affect everyone. No, thank you. Then we believe that this is right for us to intervene. It's not thank you. It's not coincidental. It's just like when a person does something that harms himself in a democratic country, we allow him to do that just a sec. But when he does something that harms society, we do not allow him to do that. This is the exact same thing.
Yes. I do not agree that the United States has much more impact than any of these countries combined. Why are we going to be in the United States and should they follow the protocol?
Because in the United States we already have recycling programs. Because in the United States they already understand the importance of recycling programs and they already do that. So we don't need to force it because it's already happening. But in the developing countries, it's not happening and therefore we need to do it. Now let's move on to the second reason why it's justified to intervene in sovereignty. We believe that pollution is irreversible damage. Scientists are saying today that we had to act 5 years ago in order to reverse the damage we caused. Today already, it's too late. But if we keep on waiting 5 more years, 10 more years, 20 more years, letting those countries to develop and develop, and we have developed countries that only then understand that they must act, no thank you, this would be way too late. No thank you. In order to solve the problem of pollution, in order to at least decrease the damage it causes, we need to act right now. We don't have time to wait for those countries to end developing, and this is why it is okay for us to intervene at this second. Now let's move on to the fact why we need to mandate it. Why we don't think that those countries are going to do it by themselves alone at the second. First of all, because we have an example in the status quo that they simply don't do it. Now, why don't we? Because when you're developing, you only think of the basic need of your citizens, of your country, of your state. You don't have time, you don't have the power, you don't have the resources to think what is beneficial for the world. We, as a developed country, we had our developing time, our developing period. Now we can sit back and see, okay, there are things that are harmful to the world, and we don't need to think only about ourselves, we need to think about the entire world because it affects everyone. But those countries, they don't have the time to do that, they don't have the power to do it, and this is what we intervene, we help them, we say, okay, we understand you don't have the time and the power and the resources to do that, so we are coming and doing it for you. We are coming and helping you to do it. We are coming and helping you to help the world because it also influences us, it also influences you, it influences everyone, and this is why we must act, and we must act now. So today, ladies and gentlemen, I showed you our mechanism by very detailed. I showed you why this is going to work, why we need to mandate it, and I showed you why this is justified to intervene. My second video is going to show you how it's going to be beneficial also to the citizens of the developing countries, and therefore it is even more justified. Thank you, and a big support.
Thank you as well. Okay, we now ask for the first opposition speaker to deliver his substantive and rebuttal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, we see a side government today that essentially stands to intelligence that because pollution exists in the world, that we should shift the burden of actually solving a problem with the people who actually cause the problem and move it to the developing nations. We see that's wrong. We're going to prove to you today how we're harming these nations, how we're forsaking the duties that they have to their people for this. We say we're going to prove to you that there are other priorities that these governments need to focus on. Then there are other priorities that from an environmental perspective, that we as a global society to solve the harms that they pointed out in global pollution. There are other things we need to focus on to actually solve it, and we talk about how it's infeasible. Right? But before I do that, I'm going to get into model. So they came up here and they said, no, pick up your trash, put it in recycling. I say no, I'm going to pick at your model. So, the first thing is a couple of things. First off, what if the developing nations don't actually want to pay? So, like, the United States doesn't even have, full-out recycling programs in, like, the state of New York. But, there are towns and cities in the United States that don't have their own recycling programs. Why would they want to go and put it into developing nations? But furthermore, is that, they can't do this, so we impose economic sanctions on these countries. So see a couple things. First off, if they don't pay, they don't do these recycling programs, you're gonna hurt them economically, you're gonna impede their development. But if they do have this recycling, I'm gonna put to you in my speech how it's like, it costs tons of money and they have other priorities. You're still impeding their development. So either way, when we see the solution best, it just harms these countries anyway. We beg them to come up and find a solution to actually solve this problem without actually harming these countries. Right? So in order to win this debate today, we have to prove to you two things. First off, we have to prove that, by mandating it and enforcing it, that it's the wrong way to go about the problem and actually finding a solution to the recycling issue. And second of all, we have to prove that there are other priorities that the government should be focusing on because they shouldn't forsake things like the quality of life of the people for the environment. They must prove we should forsake these priorities and then enforcing something in a developing country, which is like, whether, clearly there are examples of like instability and whatnot, is the best way to go about something. We beg them to do that in the next speech. So, on to our 2 points of constructive, and then I'm going to get into about topics. So, constructive. First of all, infeasibility. Now we're going to take a step back. And we're going to look at developing countries such as like Somalia and Tanzania. Also, they've got to point out and actually give an example of a country that's like developing and has pollution above the global average. I don't even think one exists. But furthermore, you look at countries like Tanzania and Somalia that are torn with political tension, and that the backlash against the government is tangible. There's tangible harms to the government trying to impose things because it's unstable. There are things like taxes that are already being paid by the people to the government, right? Theft and murder go unreported, undealt. So if you by going against the will of the people and forcing them to abide by a policy that they clearly don't want, there's proof that they're not going to do it. There's no way to actually enforce the people of a developing nation that's clearly unstable. That clearly doesn't even have the means to, impose, getting people to pay taxes. Like, we feel it's like government hasn't actually come up here and talked to how they're actually going to implement this program and get people to actually recycle. Right? Furthermore, you can impose programs on the country. The country can have programs. Doesn't mean people are going to follow it. Furthermore, to have a recycling program, a fully functioning, effective recycling program, you need to have a few things. First of all, you need to have a stable government. But, a lot of developing countries don't have stable governments. How are you going to actually impose them on there? Because in the end, these are government-run projects, right? In the end, the government is going to have control. Once you implement them, they're going to be run by the government. Second thing you need to have is reliable infrastructure. A lot of reliable infrastructure doesn't exist in developing countries because of the fact that they're developing. The third thing is that, will the people cooperate, right? A lot of the time they don't want to purely because of political backlash, because they just want to oppose the government. There's a lot of political instability. But even if they want to, they would go against it purely because the government is enforcing it. Mandating people to do something as a government, thank you, won't work. An incentive structure is better. Actually forcing people to do it isn't the solution. You look at the example of Coca-Cola in Kenya, where you can't actually purchase Coke in a plastic bottle. You purchase it in a glass bottle. You give the glass bottle back after you're done, and you get 10 shillings back. An incentive structure and giving people the option to do it is much better rather than forcing them to do it. Thank you. We beg them to prove how mandating something and forcing a country to follow it, thank you, is the better way. Furthermore, we said less than 25% of waste in developing countries is actually recyclable compared to 75% in Western countries. So, clearly there's not much of an impact they're making on a global scale in terms of pollution and recycling. We beg them to, and that's on the UN Nations Environmental Program study. Our second, thank you. Second point is about priorities. So, government priorities. So, poor countries can't really afford these kinds of programs. It costs millions to actually run a fully functioning, proper program, right? And if you don't want to actually have a fully functioning, proper program, we say don't have one at all. Don't have a half-hearted program that isn't actually doing what it needs to do in the district, right? If you're not going to do it properly, we say don't do it at all, right? So if you want to do it properly, that's going to take capital, something that these countries don't have, and something they haven't proven that developed countries are willing to pay. Furthermore, especially when they have their own obligations to their own countries. Furthermore, look at a country where people are dying of hunger. The majority of the people are below the poverty line. Watch the government be focusing its resources and time in solving that issue, when we're forsaking helping them and throwing that to the side, the value of human life to the side for the environment. We say that's bad. Because the government is accountable and in the end responsible for the people, and everything else is after that. We want to ensure the quality of life is good. The second aspect of priorities is environmental. Non-recycling is a very small impact compared to, for example, rainforest deforestation. That's something the global society should be focusing on. In the end, pollution from countries that don't even have that much pollution compared to developing countries isn't a big issue on a global scale. It's the developed countries that have all the emissions, that have pollution issues. But things like the BP oil spills actually make a difference. So, on to rebuttal. What we heard so far today. The first one was about why this is justified. It essentially says that pollution is justified, pollution creates damage, and that influencing people, we should influence people in these countries. We should do it. We should take a stance because pollution is bad. And we should try and make a difference. So, Mr. Speaker, why is the solution to stopping pollution building recycling plants which have one of the highest emission rates in itself? If you look at, my friend's going to talk about it more, but to actually run a recycling plant, it takes a lot. You actually have to burn waste. You have to filter it through. That takes money. You have to actually create a lot of emissions through recycling plants. So it's like if you in a society where there isn't even that much recycling, you're actually probably going to be making more emissions and causing more damage than you are saving. But in places like the United States, when there's just so much recycling that is possible because of the cabinet, because of the amount of recycling that's there, it's actually if you do the cost benefit analysis in the developed country, it's worth it. In a developing country, when less than 25% of the waste that they actually produce is recyclable, it's not really justified. In the developed countries like the United States, it's 75%. So that's justifiable. But furthermore, I feel like from pollution from a global perspective, we're a global society. Pollution from a developed country a developing country isn't really the issue. You look at the United States, our partner's going to talk about it more. They stepped out of the Kyoto Protocol, right? That's something we should be focusing on. Canada stepped out of the Kyoto Protocol. That's something we should be focusing on. From a global society, talk about the climate test in the UN. We say fine, but developing countries don't actually have that much of an issue. It's the developed ones. Second point is how it's justified. I said before it's too late, we should take a stance. We say, before it's too late, you should fix the developed countries. Don't actually focus your time on the people, the smallest players. Don't shift the burden of responsibility to the smallest players, because they don't really have that impact. It's the big players that do it. Those are the countries cannot do it themselves, and then we need to help them. Like I said, we look Coca-Cola. They're making an impact. We also it's not the responsibility of the developing countries to fix the problem that the developed countries have started. We're just shifting the blame, so we should take a stand, protect the developing countries, and help solve the problem from a global perspective. Actually address the main harms, the main people, the main holders that are actually accountable for the issues. The reason I'm giving you a proud to
Okay, we will now ask for the second speaker of team proposition to deliver her substantive, her rebuttal, and her refutation.
Let's talk for once not about the burdens we have in this debate, but about the burdens we have in this work, ladies and gentlemen. Developing countries, I find quite sad opposition is trying to say, actually pollute quite a lot, because this is a definition of developing countries. These are countries with a growing economy. They have a lot of factories, a lot of industry going on inside of them. You're out of order. We're talking about countries like India, like Mexico, countries with quite an industry in them, but yet countries that are still developing and still don't have, like they've told us, enough infrastructure, enough terms and conditions. Now they told us, why aren't we making the United States of America to do those recycling programs? For a few answers for that. First of all, in the United States and in all of the developed countries, we have caps for companies and for industries for the amount of pollution they can have. Why don't we have that? We have that in the developing world because we want companies to go there. We want to keep their economy developing. What's the difference between this and recycling programs is that recycling programs are retroactive. They don't actually damage the companies in there, and thus they are actually letting the economy keep on going. The second answer is we are willing to debate, no thank you, whether or not we should impose some sanctions of some sort, maybe about some developed countries, but they're not actually dealing with what we told you about the developing world. Second thing we heard is that the citizens there just won't do it because they want to oppose the government. A few answers for that. First of all, one of the biggest problems in the developing world is the fact that they have waste in the streets. They have, people in Shanghai, for example, can't go out to the street without a mask on their face because of the air pollution. No, thank you. In India, you have the streets with sewage, with hazardous waste from companies and from factories. No, thank you. Recycling programs, while costs a lot of money, take that waste and turn it into something better. No, thank you. This actually benefits the citizens directly, so they will do it. Second of all, we have something that's called the law, and we have something that's called punishment, and this is how we actually impose programs in the entire world. No, thank you. Third answer is you're completely ignoring the part of our mechanism that says education. We'd like to hear a response for that. Then we heard they don't actually have a functioning government. To this we say, again, ignoring our mechanism, we're saying a committee from the UN, regulations from the UN will be in those countries and will make those things work. The third thing we heard is no, thank you, they have no infrastructure. To this we agree partially. We say that again, our mechanism says, let's help them, let's take developed countries to help them, let's make companies help them. Why would developed countries do this? Again, because this is a global crisis and everybody understands it. We see that the European Union actually does things like recycling. We see that here, all of the beans are recycling beans, okay? They understand the importance of that, and they know that the developing countries cause some of that. Now, then we heard, let's incentivize them to do that, like we do in Kenya with Coca-Cola bottles from glass. This is the meaning of recycling programs, ladies and gentlemen. This is basically what we want to do. Yes, I will take a point.
Okay, but it's not the meaning of mandate.
Thank you. The point of mandating is not mandating each and every citizen to recycle, but mandating to the entire country to impose some recycling programs. This includes the whole thing about glass bottles, includes education, includes having recycling bins, and includes making every type of company or factory, deal with its own waste. Then we heard about priorities. I will actually discuss that in my point, and then basically that's all we've heard. So, to my point, it's actually going to talk to you about, again, first of all, a big point of rebuttal, okay? When we heard, let's not do it at all if we can't do it properly. By that logic, we shouldn't do anything if it wouldn't work by 100%. We're saying even if we can solve 30% of the problem, we want to do it because this is a problem that is amazingly dangerous. Now, another question to start opposition. Do you think it's okay to sanction Iran for developing a nuclear bomb? We do that. No, thank you. Because this is a danger that is global, that threatens the entire world. This is the exact same case. Okay, about priorities, about life and death in the third world, and how this actually benefits the people of the developing countries. First of all, one of the biggest problems we have currently in developing countries is not only the hunger, it's also the medical conditions we have there. Again, like I've told you in my rebuttal, the very dire conditions you have in the streets. The fact you have hazardous waste going on in the streets. You can't drink your water, you don't have forests to clean your air. Basically, you're living in garbage. And this garbage, by all means, is a part of the development, is a part of the economy. Once we're saying no thank you, let's have recycling programs. We're basically directly dealing with what bothers those people most. By going to India and imposing a recycling program there, mandating each and every company and each and every person, organization in India to clean the streets, to take the waste out of the tunnels, out of the water, and to purify it and to make it into something better. And we have technologies for that, by the way. We're basically helping directly the citizens of India so that they could drink the water, so that they could go walk around in the streets and have a normal condition of life. So basically, this proposition helps directly what bothers those people's lives and helps directly with the medicine. Another very important point is to remember that waste brings a lot of diseases to those places. So basically, taking it and recycling it and not putting it in the streets is something that will eventually equate having humanitarian aid to hospitals, because we're basically taking the root of the problem and not just trying to deal with it. No, thank you. Second of all, our proposition creates more jobs. And this basically kind of relates to what they told us about our mechanism. Who's going to do it? What's going to exactly happen there? We're talking about a huge chain of workers, of supervisors, of scientists, of people who will actually go ahead and clean, of people who will take the garbage from the recycling bins. This sounds like a very small project, but in a country like India with 1 billion people, we think this is a huge scale of a project, of a proposition. Now, what does this lead to? Other than the UN committee that will be there to regulate the big picture, we need a lot of workers to man the small-scale jobs. For example, again, so basically, this actually directly deals with the citizens and their problems. Again, and the third thing we have to discuss here is the fact that in the long run, it brings more room for human hunger and with other third world problems. Because first of all, it takes away the burden that they have to stop the pollution from happening in there. And second of all, once the entire world sees that third world countries and developing economies do something to help with the recycling program, we think they will be much more likely to donate to humanitarian aid. Because right now we see a lot of countries blamed actually for the huge, massive harm that they're causing. We see this example with China. We see this example with South America countries. So what did we show you in our speech today? We showed you the side of opposition basically failed to tackle the entire proposition about doing it in the third world countries and never showed us a concrete harm to third world countries. But the only thing they told us is, why don't we do that to the United States? And we're saying, this is not our burden to show you in this debate today. Our burden is to show you, go ahead and do it in the third world. And for this reason, I beg you to propose.
Okay, now ask for the second speaker of side opposition to deliver her substantive rebuttal and refutation.
Mr. Speaker, today we see before us a side government which has grossly overstated the benefits of recycling. We said we have before us a side government that seems to have this belief that recycling solves all environmental problems, right? We've heard these examples of like filtering out the water, removing sewage from the streets, right? Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, like those are great things to do, but that's not recycling, right? What recycling is you take a plastic water bottle, melt it down, and turn it into another plastic water bottle. Unfortunately, purifying water doesn't count as recycling. That's not what the word means, Mr. Speaker. That's not what this debate is about. Okay, so I'm going to be moving today for you through some refutation of what we heard coming from side government. Then I'll be rebutting my partner's point and moving into my own perspective of kind of like the global effect. This is a two-tier idea, like why is it philosophically bad? And secondly, like what are like the actual tangible harms, which they seem to think we have presented none, so I'll spend lots of time on it, I promise. Now let's start with some refutation, right? So we heard this constructive point just now about the benefits. So it was kind of twofold, right? We heard this idea, one, like in like India, right, we see waste in the streets, no thank you. You know, there's no forest to clean the air, there's like sewage, there's disease. Like, yes, we agree, but this assertion that the recycling program will clean out the streets and remove like dirt and filth and disease, like we just don't see the logic here, Mr. Speaker, right? What they presented to us today is like basically, no thank you, they said like, okay, so here's why we don't have caps on emissions in this country, right? Because we want companies to go in there and build factories, and then we want to retroactively fix the problem. Okay, as my partner pointed out to you, how are we retroactively fixing the problem of air pollution? By building plants that have an extremely high emissions rate, Mr. Speaker, right? Like, recycling plants are actually very damaging to the environment. The only time a recycling plants, like, it's actually swallow these harms is when there's too much garbage for landfills. We see that, like, the majority of New York State doesn't have a recycling program that's, like, government mandated. We said they have to make the option because it's so expensive and so taxing on the economy and so damaging to their environment that, like, New York State can't afford to do it. Mr. Speaker, if New York State can't economically support recycling, how is Uganda supposed to do it, right? We don't see how this developing nation is supposed to support something that the United States, the most developed economy in the world, is struggling to do, right? We think that they need to point out to us, they need to explain how they're supposed to afford this. Even if these developing nations are only paying a small margin, this margin is still too large for them, Mr. Speaker. It's still, we're speaking about millions of dollars, right? No, thank you.
Okay, we also heard the second idea, right, about jobs created. So they said like this directly benefits directly benefits citizens. We're like reducing unemployment rates. This is really good. All right, let's think about the economics of recycling for a second, right? Let's look at the fact that per ton, twice as much money is used to recycle than comes back from recycling. It directly eats money. No money comes back out of recycling. Like for every $2 or for every $1 earned, it's $2 spent, right? We think this is really, really bad. Like, why are we trying to impose something upon a developing nation? One that, I'll take you in a moment, one that needs to further their economy, one that needs to like invest in industry and push forth their economy by saying, all right, let's impose this on you so that you have a large factory in your city that's eating up the economy, that's directly just taking money away from the city.
Yeah, even if that's true, isn't the price worth it so that we could leave in this planet 100 years from now?
No, okay, here's the biggest assertion that we see on side government that we have a large problem with that we think they need to explain to us. We begged side government to come up today and explain to us how building a landfill in India is a global problem, right? We don't think that landfills are actually a global issue. What is a global issue is these ideas of like water pollution, right? Of air pollution, and unfortunately recycling doesn't solve these problems, right? We see that they like majorly misrepresented what recycling looks like. We see that they've majorly over-exaggerated what recycling can really solve. All right, now let's move into my concern to point about global affairs, right? So let's move into this first idea. Why is this philosophically bad, right? Even before we get into the actual tangible harms, right? We said the Western world should just not be able to dictate to the developing world, right? The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, when we were developing, we didn't have emission caps. No one was mandating our recycling programs because what we needed to do was develop industry first and then try to solve the problem, right? We see that it's just fundamentally wrong for the hypocrisy of the West here. We see that it's fundamentally wrong for the West to say, okay, we did what we had to do to develop, oh, but now we're developed, so now you can't do what you need to develop, right? We see that, yes, there are tangible harms of not having emissions caps, but we think that just philosophically, there's a fundamental, like, hypocrisy within the West for saying that it's okay for us to do it, but India, you can't develop. India, you know what? Eat up your economy with this recycling mandate because we've already developed, so it's not our problem any longer. We think this is fundamentally wrong to support within the West. We don't think that we should be like saying just because we have more money and we can go about dictating things like this to developing nations that we have the right to do so. Like we think that like we use any means necessary to develop, and now we're going back and saying, but listen, you can't. We're to develop, so it's not our problem to stop damaging our world, which we broke in the first place, right? Secondly, let's move into this idea. Oh, no, sorry. Maybe, right, this hypocrisy would be okay if it was a large pressing issue. Like maybe if we're trying to impose emission caps on these countries, maybe we concede, yes, we're damaging the whole globe. But we fail to see how this fairly minor environmental issue of landfills is like large enough that we have the right to dictate what they are, what they do and don't do. No, thank you. All right, the second idea, right? Why is this practically bad, right? So we said, like, when a Western nation is able to impose something expensive, impractical, and useless to developing nations, like this impedes development, right? So think about this a little more. Like these countries are very poor, Mr. Speaker, right? We think that this is also something that side government seems to step over all the time. Like, you know, they've addressed this idea of education, right? It's in their model. Like, why are we dealing with this idea of education? Mr. Speaker, the reason we can't educate all the children of India on why to recycle is because they don't have an education system. They don't have schools, right? See, there's a large problem with the fact that you cannot educate people who don't have access to an education system. So yes, maybe education is the solution to environmental problems, but if that's the case, we need to be giving the budget of these governments. These developing nations have a very limited budget to supporting things like education, to supporting things like hospitals, to supporting things like, feeding the people, and not to like supporting, let's build these large plants when we could just put it in the landfill and deal with it when we have the economy. We don't think that recycling is nearly as large an issue as we continue to state. Okay, all right, let's think about this further, right? Like these countries are very, very poor, and they need to be able to use their resources and nearly any way they want to. We see the only time we have found to step in on this that directly affects the planet. We said they have failed to show us how it does this, so we don't think that we have the grounds to oppose this, right?
Now,
Sure.
when we make a factory recycle its waste instead of throwing it to the sea, doesn't that help the global environment?
Okay, we don't see why factory would throw its waste into the sea, right? We said like we built a landfill just like we did in the rest of the world, but furthermore, like, no, like, we just don't agree that, like, maybe a little bit of litter is worth, like, eating up the economy of developing nations and entirely stopping their development, right? Okay, so basically, like, if anything, this, like, rich world domination of poor countries, like, it perpetuates the cycle of poverty, right? Because we treat them like children, like, the rich developed world,
As a parent, we treat them like they're inferior. If anything, this is stopping development. But like furthermore, it adds a little more tangible harm. For you, the United States, I spoke to this earlier, does not have mandatory recycling in a lot of places, Mr. Speaker, because most municipalities in New York State and many other states just simply cannot afford this economically. It's simply too damaging. The only reason we see recycling in New York City is because the concentration of people got to be too high, and New York City said, okay, we have enough business and a high enough population that we can support this. We will take the harm, we will take the hit on our economy because we can afford to do it now, but it took a very long time and is very, very taxing on the economy, and furthermore, it's only really possible when the bulk of recycling is large enough that you can try to be efficient. But as our partner spoke to you about today, the percentage of waste that's actually recyclable is slim. Like it's like 20% of waste can be recycled in these nations, so we can't even be efficient because the majority of stuff isn't even recyclable, Mr. Speaker. So for what we've talked to you about today, we're very proud to oppose this bill.
Okay, we would now call to the third proposition speaker deliver his speech. This better be very liked by his colleagues.
So I have to roll this. I'm going to get lost.
We're ready for you.
Oh wow.
Thank you.
That's what we went. This will work. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we see a problem of team opposition saying that on one hand recycling is not important, on the other hand saying it is important. We really want them to clarify that in the next speech. Are they for recycling or just a huge amount of waste of money, and we should never do it in any state because well it simply does not worth it. We believe it's very worth it, and we'll be explaining what I'm going to do in my speech. So my speech I'm going to actually show you why it's A, it's justified, B, why it will work and will create a better world for everyone, okay? Ladies and gentlemen, that is the crucial part of the debate. We're talking about global issues, and that is actually the main two main clash. A, justification, and the practicality of our model. Okay, before that, let's get to two main problems the opposite side of our case. A, what is recycling? They claim we are talking about something that's not recycling, it's not just taking a bottle, putting it like the special bin that we have right here, and that's it. Well, no, recycling is actually taking something and using it again. Taking dirty water, making it clean, and use it again to do something. Not thank you. Take it, not thank you. That is the difference of recycling. Actually, recycle means why you have that logo of like something that goes in a circle, because recycling goes in a circle. You start at one point, you use it again and again and again. No, thank you. That is recycling, that's what we're talking about, and that is why I'm going to show you how it will solve. Second issue, they're talking, well, why not just talk about developed countries? Like developing countries do not have anything. Well, developed countries, although we agree that not all of them have such 100% recycling programs, and we say that we do, in some cases, agree that we need to implement the same motion there, but not a few. And second of all, we see that the developed countries have shown to realize that recycling is important. They have shown that, for example, take Czech Republic, there are actually more special bins in this school than regular bins. Why is that? Because they understand recycling is important, and there's absolutely no need for mandating them and saying, okay, you need not to impose recycling programs, because they agree and they are going forward to actually creating such. Now,
in the developing world, if there are countries that actually agree to do recycling programs without us mandating them, they are not in the debate. The debate is about developing countries, I'll take in a second, that actually do not have recycling programs and will not listen when we say you need to have that, and therefore we have the economic sanctions that we set you. So that is why recycling is what we said to you, and we need to focus on the world because, well, it is important they do pollute, yes.
What the example of the Czech Republic? We generally be like, yeah, they realize it because they're a developed country. Shouldn't we give these countries a chance to develop and then realize it? Don't you think it's hypocritical? You didn't just define this point.
No, because while they're developing, when they're polluting our planet, there's a global issue. That leads me to my first class. This is justified. Here we have outside opposite only the hypothesis that we are hypocrites because, well, when we were developed countries, we did not have these stupid environment programs, and, well, they also should, because we don't have the right. That we have a few answers. First, then there was not a global issue of environment. Like right now, back then, there was not a global environment because there actually were no real pollution. Right now there is pollution, and also right now we do know that we have pollution. No, thank you. Second of all, we do not agree that just because we agree that back then, if we knew that pollution will occur and we'll have the globalization problem of climate change, no, thank you, then we'll still agree that we had to somehow impose on our developing countries before we became developed to do such things. That's why maybe it's not true. We're just saying, okay, back then we did not know, now we know, now it's also your burden in our world to do so. That's why the hypocrite part falls in this debate to our side. We are not hypocrite, we just, right now we know the issue and we want to solve it, and that is the best way to do so. Now, damage to the whole world. Here, they said recycling does not solve, like they do not solve about the problem with climate change because it's not air pollution. With water pollution, for example, like this is important, and recycling is about also water, and we told you. And B, also another important issue that is presented, yet they forgot to refute, is about actually the resources, how we use resources over and over and more and more and more and more, and by that we actually finish the resources we have on the planet. That is a known fact. Recycling actually clearly helps in that issue, and so we do. If recycling does help the global issue. Now, why developing countries have such a major part? Well, because of the current state, they have an industry that goes on, and they not refute that goes along and develops over and over and over, and actually that. And also, that is the first thing. And second, we'll also look at the future. These countries that are developing countries, and so, but inherently, they're going to pollute more at the future because they are developing. It's actually like we pollute more right now. The US pollutes more right now than they did 50 years ago. That's why we believe right now is the crucial time to do so, because these countries are so self-focused with their region, they do not have the chance to think about the global issues. Now that's something important. If something, harms the world globally, we agree that we need to intervene. Exactly like we gave you the example of Iran. They usually did not refute, they understand that they agree. Iran had the possibility of actually creating a harm to the whole world, and that's why we agree we need to use force in order to, like, economic sanctions whatsoever. Now, thank you. The same thing here. We proved to you that because these developing countries harm the world globally, then we have the right to intervene and medicine to have this kind of recycling program. Now, second investigation about benefits to the citizens. Well, the only thing they said to us is, well, it harms them economically, and the fact that, well, how we will still have water in the streets. Well, no, we're talking about actually taking the garbage that factories put in the streets or in the sea or in the forests or any place they find it and recycle it and use it again. Yes.
Okay, we talked about how the entire justification for all of this is because people pollute and that causes harms. So people driving in the United States, why don't we want that? Because that's pollution.
We try to actually make things better with cars, that cars less pollute. That's saying that we're having actually deal with the issue that you were just presenting, so it's not relevant. Now, So we see do have beneficial incentives because they will have better lives as a whole. And so it is not justified because it helps the whole world, it's justified because it helps the citizens. Okay, the world work. On that, it's a really easy clash goes to us. Because A, state or governments, they're not figure out about how they have to regulate that, no problem. Education, we do have education systems in those countries, and also we're talking about propaganda, about commercials, actually saying that, listen, recycling is important, therefore we should do it, we're helping them realize that, also saying the government ought to do that. Second of all, and that is that it solves, that is what we said to about how it actually will help, because the fact that they will have this, they will, so at the end of the day, they will have these programs, the citizens will recycle more. So at the end of the day, we have shown you a burden that A, is justified, and B, it solves the problem that we are so crucially need to solve in order to live on our planet in 100 years from now, therefore will win. Thank you.
Okay, we would now ask for the last constructed speaker of team opposition to deliver her speech.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the speaker from side proposition that we just heard from told you that we had a contradiction within our case, and I'd just like to clear that up right before we get into this. So they told you that we said that recycling is important, but then that we said recycling isn't so important. Mr. Speaker, what we're saying on our side of the House is that in fact, we think recycling is a good thing. We think recycling is useful. However, we do not think recycling is fundamental. We do not think that recycling is the biggest priority that we have, both for the environment and for the citizens of the developing nations. We think that, that recycling programs are sort of like a good thing to have for a country that can afford them. We don't think they're essential. We don't think that they're integral. We don't think they're fundamental to a country. Therefore, I hope that clears up the contradiction and side proposition sort of understands where we're going with this. So I'd like to break down the debate into two main questions. Firstly, is it fair to intervene in these countries? And secondly, will it be effective? So firstly, Mr. Speaker, is it actually fair to intervene? And we heard this example coming out of the proposition. They told us if something hurts the world, if something impacts the global society, then we need to intervene. And they gave me this example of Iran and its nuclear weapons. Mr. Speaker, for one, we do not think that you can equate landfills with nuclear weapons. Okay? We think that's a false analogy. Secondly, I have a couple more responses to this. We think that primarily, we think primarily recycling is not as damaging as side proposition, or excuse me, not recycling is not that damaging. We think that side proposition has overstated the benefits of recycling. We think that fundamentally, Mr. Speaker, what you get when you recycle is not as much as you put into it. We think that the emissions that come out of a recycling plant are actually more damaging to the globe. We think that if we're talking about a global problem, we're talking about things like air pollution and water pollution, things that happen when you build recycling plants, things that happen when you invest a lot of money and resources into these kinds of things. We think that fundamentally, Mr. Speaker, if as side proposition told you there is so much garbage and sewage in the streets, we think clearly even their waste removal, their regular garbage system is ineffective. We think maybe we should resolve that before implementing a recycling program. We think, Mr. Speaker, if people can't throw away their garbage, why would they be able to throw away their recycling, Mr. Speaker? We think that obviously the systems in these countries are flawed. We don't think we can implement a recycling program and assume it will work. Okay, but moving on to a little bit more of whether we're justified to intervene. We think that furthermore, the emissions that come from the developed world are so much larger than the emissions that come from the developing nations. That it's hypocritical, not only because we developed in this way, but also because we continue to develop in this fashion, Mr. Speaker. Because countries like Canada and America continue to disregard the Kyoto Protocol. We can't even count our own carbon emissions. How can we impose these kinds of these kinds of programs on a developing nation, Mr. Speaker. That's just not fair. But you disagree?
That has nothing to do with reality. The fact that they don't do it doesn't mean we don't have to do another thing to help the environment.
Okay, so what we're hearing from the proposition is we don't have to help the environment, we have to force other countries to help the environment. We think that that's not fair, Mr. Speaker. We think that fundamentally the important part about this is that the countries who have both the resources, the ability, and are at fault for causing the environmental problems should probably be the first ones to step up and do something about it. We don't think that it's fair that we invade the sovereignty of a developing nation who's actually just trying to get up on their feet. We think that these countries simply cannot afford the kinds of programs side proposition seems to think that they do. My partner told you the fact that the Western world should not be able to dominate the developing world. They told us that back when we're talking about when the Western world was developing, there were no environmental problems. But we see that we got this way because of the Western world. We think the Western world needs to have more of a hand in fixing the problem instead of blaming the developing world for their problems.
Wow.
We also think that that the priorities of the government are being disregarded. We think that fundamentally both the citizens need to be taken care of, the government is accountable to the people. I'm going to be explaining in my second point about why you shouldn't be banning the desk. And secondly, we think that they have environmental priorities. We think that fundamentally, when you are talking about things like the Amazon deforestation, these are much bigger issues than recycling. We got no response from the proposition. Okay, so let's talk about my second question, whether or not this will be effective. All right, so as my partners told you, this idea that recycling can somehow solve the problem of water purification, that recycling can somehow solve the problem of sewage in the streets, we think that's false. We think that proposition has either changed the definition of recycling, or even if we want to go under this definition, we didn't hear much about it in the model. We didn't hear, how are you going to implement these water filtration systems? We didn't hear, how are you going to fund them? We think that these are very, very expensive things. No, thank you. We think that fundamentally, Mr. Speaker, when you have a country in which apparently sewage runs down the streets, we think that it's going to take quite a lot of money, quite a lot of resources to fix the problems, that fundamentally, if a country is that bad, the government ought to be concerned, and is probably very concerned, with things like infrastructure, with things like feeding the public, with things like maybe building schools so that proposition can put the education in that they want. We don't think that their model is feasible. My partner talked about this in his first constructive point. We think that for things like the fact that people don't even pay taxes in many of these countries, that we have problems with following the law. We think that these kinds of things in which people are not incentivized to help follow these programs, we think that definitely they're not going to work properly. They told us that even if nothing works like completely properly, it's still worth trying. And we agree with this up to a point. We think that it's okay if not everybody follows the recycling programs. However, we do think if nobody follows the recycling programs, we think, I'll take it in a moment, we think that if these programs are not doing at all what they set out to do, we think if they're losing money, if they're not helping the environment, if they're emitting a lot of carbon emissions, we think that's a bad thing. Yeah.
How is the fact that we're cutting off forests and trees, polluting the rivers with hazardous waste factories instead of recycling, not hurting the global environment?
Mr. Speaker, what does cutting down trees have to do with recycling? We think that fundamentally the idea that we're going to prevent deforestation by recycling is flawed, because we think that a lot of the materials in developing nations are made out of non-recyclable materials. We think that fundamentally it is the developed nations that have a lot of things like plastics and these kinds of things that can be recycled. We think that maybe you will be helping slightly to have like recycled products, but we don't think that's enough. We think that the answer to things like the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest is not to do with recycling, Mr. Speaker. No, thank you, it's protected time. We think that fundamentally, when we have things like huge environmental problems with things like mining, with things like unsustainable farming practices that actually can destroy large parts of an area and make them unusable for like centuries to come, we think that these are kind of problems we need to be tackling, Mr. Speaker. Recycling, as we've already outlined, doesn't work to solve these kinds of problems that side proposition seems to think it does. They've highly overstated to you the benefits of recycling. They've told you recycling can solve like basically all of the environmental problems. We think it's worth trying to solve environmental problems, but assuming recycling is the way to do it is wrong. We think that fundamentally all you're going to end up doing is hurting the developing nations, because if they are sensible and don't follow the recycling programs because they can't afford to, because it impedes their development, as my partner talked about in the second point, we think if they don't follow it, it will impose economic sanctions sanctions on them and hurt them further, Mr. Speaker. All side proposition wants to do for you today is hurt the developing nations. Side opposition stands on the fact that it is not fair to intervene and that this will not be effective. Therefore, we're very proud to oppose this resolution. Thank
Okay, we will now ask for the Vice Speaker of Team Opposition to end the debate on their side.
Mr. Speaker, side government's been doing a lot of jumping up and down. I'm going to sit them down for once and for all through my speech today. Right? The two main questions I could really boil down this debate and show you why it falls on side opposition. The first question being, good work and what is the government's responsibility? The second being, what is better for global pollution? What will actually solve the problem? Is this the way to go? So, what is the government's responsibility, right? Is that like, essentially what we say is that no, it's hard to implement something, it's hard to build it, it's hard to, we've proven to you today that it's hard to actually see this through. So what we say is, okay, fine, this is what's going to happen. You're going to build it. But we ask them this: how do you ensure that everyone actually recycles? Right? These places are corrupt and unstable. If you want to waste millions of dollars and go building recycling plants for the sake of it, go ahead. But how do you ensure that that Tommy in the slum of Africa is actually going to recycle his coal products and his paper and whatnot? There's no actual way to implement this. You know, it's different in a Western society. We have things like the census. You can actually see when someone's recycling a lot of their bins and whatnot. But it's not the same situation at all in a place like Africa or in a place like India, where there's it's extremely unstable. It's not a fully functioning developed place. It's hard to implement something. I give you the example of building schools in Africa. People don't build schools in Africa. Doesn't mean that we see now is 5 years down the road, these schools are empty. No one actually uses these buildings. But you know why? Because the kids are actually working on the farm. They can't actually go to the school. But it's the same similar analogy. You can build as many recycling plants as you want. Doesn't mean people are actually going to use them. Right? Furthermore, talking about the wrong philosophy. How just because now that the Western nations have developed, that we can shift the burden of blame onto the developing nations. You know what? It's your responsibility to take care of this mess. We should start your development. We feel no, that's harmful for global for progression as a global society. It impacts world diplomacy. Those are negative impacts. We also talked about how the countries in the third countries within the United Nations don't even have full recycling programs developed in their own countries. We talked about the state of New York. Why would we want to go give money into a country that's not theirs and they don't even have it developed in their own? Because that's a flaw in their case. The entire justification is that pollution is harmful, right? But that's it. Pollution is harmful, therefore we should intervene, right? So so when we say all that, and by that stance, we say, okay, fine. So why don't we implement this in the United States, where their impact by non-recycling is much greater than a developing nation such as Kenya? Watching the United Nations Environmental Program analysis, really it's a good thing, but it's not an essential thing. People don't even put the garbage away in these countries. We make sure they go put it in their recycling plants. Right? The second question, what's better for global pollution? They think that recycling solves the greenhouse effect. We say no. We say, the people in the United States that stop driving their cars that produce carbon emissions is going to stop the greenhouse effect. No recycling your plastic bottles and your pieces of paper. Furthermore, we talked about we shouldn't. They said that we should do it because it's pollution. And it's our global planet. We say, you know what, yeah, it is pollution, it's our global planet, but this isn't the way to solve it, Mr. Speaker. There are other methods. We've proven to you today that carbon emissions from the United States and developing countries are the worst, are statistically the most impactful. Cows farming and producing methane, that's the second leader in carbon emissions in our globe, not people recycling their paper. They failed to actually prove to you how that will actually stop the greenhouse effect, because that's the issue about global warming, that's the issue about pollution. In the end, it's the greenhouse effect, it's the ozone layer. Us recycling has absolutely nothing to do. It does. It's very, very minimal compared to the other significant impact that the Western society makes. Furthermore, we said that the U.S. doesn't do it, and we should focus on that. The U.S. has more of an impact. We got to the stage because of the developed countries. We got to the issue where the pollution is such a big problem because of the developed countries. We should deal with it with them. They should pay the price. They should face the burden of having to deal with it, not the developed country. It's an unfair shift of burdens, and that's the reason that we are proud to.
Okay, and ending the Octofinals of Part of Europe 2013, we call the proposition reply speaker.
So in order to show you how we won this debate, I'm going to ask 3 questions. The first one, what is recycling and does it actually help to the environment? The second one, is our solution going to change anything? And the third one, is it justified to do it specifically in developing nations? So let's begin with the first question. What is recycling exactly? Because we had a lot of disagreement about it. Recycling is taking something, use it, then taking it, mold it a bit differently, and use it again. I think that on that definition, both sides agree. They think that recycling is only taking plastic bottles and use them again. We believe that, first of all, plastic bottles are pretty important because let's all remember that plastic comes from oil, which is a resource that is going to end soon. We all talk about it. We all try to find different alternatives to oil. So I think using that plastic again and again and again is something important that will benefit our society. But other than that, also using paper, which are coming from cutting off trees in the Amazonas, ladies and gentlemen, using it again, and by that preventing the cut of trees, and by that preventing the global warming, and by that preventing the destruction of the ecological system, ladies and gentlemen, it is also recycling, and people obviously completely ignore that fact. And actually taking water that we use in our plants, filthy water, and then filter it and then use them again in the plants instead of just throwing it to the sea by destroying our ecological system is also recycling using the elements. And why don't we actually prove it? And according also to side opposite logic, if it is the case, it needs to be recycling, then recycling is a good thing that helps society, that helps the environment, ladies and gentlemen. And this is why recycling will actually do something. Now, let's go to the second question, is it actually going to work? We heard from them that in developing countries, in developing nations, people don't have the knowledge and education that we need to recycle, and therefore will not do it, and even if they will do it, it will not work 100%. We have 3 answers to that. The first one we told you that it means they say that it is going to work at some portion of the amount of we want it to work. And we said, okay, it's fine with us. No plan is working 100%, and we believe that some is better than nothing. We never heard a proper response to that. Then we've told you, in their third piece, they said it is helping, but it's not helping enough. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if it is helping, we want to do that because we believe that the other solution will harm the developing nations even more than this solution. Actually, preventing developing nations to develop will harm them more than just take a bit of their money that they gain and use it in order to help society, to help the planet, and by that helping the nations themselves. At the end, they told us that people are not educated to it because they don't have the infrastructure to educate. We said 2 things for that. First of all, this is not true. We do have schools. Maybe they are not the best schools as in Canada, but we do have schools. And second of all, we said that we will use commercials, we will use a lot of propaganda and stuff, so we do have a way to educate the people. Now, let's move to the third and last question. Is it justified to do it specifically in developing nations? What we told you today is that we told you that A, because they are developed, they won't do it by themselves. They agree with us. B, we told you that it impacts the entire world, and again we proved it with the rainforest, we proved it with the water industry, infected water, etc., etc., etc. They said that this is not true, but never explained to us why, when we kept explaining it and actually proving you that this is true. And third of all, we told you that doing it in developing nations doesn't mean we won't do it in developed nations. This is not mutually exclusive, ladies and gentlemen, which is something they completely ignore. Don't hear what they say. They said that this is hypocrite for us, and we have 3 answers for that. First of all, in the past, we didn't know that this will happen. Today, we do know. Second of all, we need to do something now, and therefore, it is okay for us to force it. And third of all, we assist those countries. We help them, and it is also happening in most developing nations. And then they said it won't change anything, and we only harm. And we only harm it. First of all, we proved that this is completely not true, again and again. And second, we showed you how it's also helping the developing nations, which they never refuted. Therefore, we proved that recycling is important, that in those nations it's more important, and therefore I beg you to propose.